Prince William had already made his decision before Camilla's car reached the end of the driveway. What he and King Charles found inside her private villa, a place she had protected from the world for years, was not the kind of discovery that allows for deliberation. The photographs were real. The annotations were real. The hatred preserved across those walls with such careful, deliberate precision was real. And in the hours that followed, William moved with a quiet resolve that those closest to the palace had never seen from him before, dismantling, one privilege at a time, everything Camilla had spent 2 decades building beside the crown. But what Charles and William actually found inside that villa, and why it left them both speechless in a way that no royal crisis ever had before, is a story that begins not with scandal, but with a door that should never have been opened. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation. Stories like this rarely end where they begin, and what comes next may completely change how you see this family. But to understand why William acted with such finality, we need to go back to the morning they first stepped through that villa door, and to the moment the walls began to speak. The morning had begun like any other routine inspection. King Charles moved through the gates of the private estate with the measured composure of a man who had spent his entire life performing duty before emotion. Prince William walked beside him, hands folded behind his back, his expression calm and professional. Neither man had expected anything unusual. The villa had always been described to them in the same careful language: private, well-maintained, impeccably ordered. Camilla's personal retreat, her space, a place the palace respected without question. The exterior confirmed everything they had been told. Freshly painted walls caught the morning light. The hedgerows were trimmed with architectural precision. The windows gleamed. Even the gravel beneath their feet had been raked into clean, deliberate lines. Charles paused at the entrance, his hand resting briefly against the iron gate. Something about the stillness gave him pause, not an alarm, not yet. Simply a quality of silence that felt heavier than the surroundings deserved. Inside, the luxury was immediate and undeniable. Polished floors reflected the pale light streaming through tall windows. The furniture had been chosen with the eye of someone who understood exactly how comfort was supposed to appear. Books lined the shelves in careful rows. Flowers stood in precise arrangements on every surface. The villa did not simply look expensive. It looked controlled, every object placed with an intention that went beyond decoration. They moved through the entrance hall slowly, commenting on minor details the way men do when they are not yet looking for anything in particular. The carpets were new. The drapes had been recently altered. Even the silverware arranged along the dining room sideboard bore no trace of use. Charles ran a finger across the surface of the dining table and said nothing. William examined the crystal glasses near the window, their angles catching the light in perfect sequence. It was only when they reached the far corridor that everything changed. The first photograph appeared almost innocuously, a familiar face, a public smile, a moment captured at what looked like a charity event decades past. But as Charles stepped closer, the details resolved themselves into something that stopped the breath in his throat. A pair of horns had been drawn across the image in heavy black marker. Beneath the smiling face, 2 words had been written with deliberate care. He did not say them aloud. William stepped forward, and his reaction was immediate and physical. His shoulders drew back. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved along the wall with the expression of a man who is counting something and does not want to reach the final number. Because the photographs did not stop at 1, they did not stop at 5 or 10 or 20. They covered the wall in both directions, with the density of a private archive assembled over years. Images of Diana at public events, at private moments caught by long lenses, at occasions the palace had never formally documented. And across nearly every one of them, the same hand had left the same marks. Annotations, alterations, words that no room in any royal property should ever have contained. Charles whispered something. William did not respond. The villa's quiet, which had seemed peaceful from the outside, now felt like something else entirely. They had entered a house. They had found something closer to a confession, and neither man was yet ready to understand what it meant. Neither man spoke for a long time. Charles stood at the center of the corridor with his hands pressed together at his waist, the way he stood when he was managing something too large for ordinary expression. His eyes moved across the wall slowly, not frantically, not with the sharp urgency of someone searching for answers, but with the terrible patience of a man who had already understood and was simply waiting for himself to accept it. His breathing was measured. His face had gone very still. And that stillness, to anyone who knew him well, was far more alarming than anger would have been. William had moved to the far end of the corridor. He stood with his back partially turned, one hand resting against the wall beside a photograph he had not looked away from in several minutes. It was an image of his mother at what appeared to be a garden event. She was laughing, her head tilted slightly, entirely unaware of the camera. Beneath her face, a single word had been written in the same deliberate hand that marked every other image in the room. William did not read it aloud. He did not need to. What passed between father and son in those minutes was not a conversation. It was something quieter and more damaging than that, the shared recognition of a truth that, once seen, could not be returned to the place where it had been safely invisible. Charles finally crossed the room and stood beside his son. He looked at the photograph William had been studying. He looked at the word beneath it. Then he turned and walked back toward the entrance of the corridor without speaking, and William understood that they were moving deeper into the villa, not away from it. Whatever was in the next room, and the room after that, they were going to face it together. The sitting room confirmed what the corridor had suggested. Diana's life had been documented here with a comprehensiveness that went far beyond the casual collecting of press clippings or the ordinary accumulation of royal archive material. There was a map pinned to the wall beside a curtained window, its surface marked with careful annotations that traced her movements across Europe across several years. Colored lines connected cities. Dates had been written beside each point, small and precise, in handwriting that was immediately recognizable. William stopped in front of the map and did not move for a long time. Charles stood behind him and said very quietly that they needed to look at everything. All of it. Before they made any decisions, before they spoke to anyone, before they allowed themselves to react rather than understand. His voice was steady, but William heard something beneath the steadiness that he had never heard from his father before, something that sounded, beneath all the composure and the training and the lifelong discipline of public duty, like fear. They moved through the sitting room without touching anything. The map remained on the wall behind them as they walked away from it, its lines connecting city after city in patient, deliberate silence. But none of them yet understood how long this had been building or how many layers remained beneath what they had already seen. The villa had not always felt this way. Those who had worked there in the early years described it differently. A quiet place, yes, and a private one, but not an unsettling one. The stillness in those first seasons had been the ordinary stillness of a house whose owner valued solitude above company. Staff came and went without incident. Instructions were precise but not unusual. The rooms were kept immaculate, the gardens tended on a strict schedule, and Camilla herself arrived each year with the same calm efficiency, unpacked her belongings without assistance, and settled into a routine that no one was invited to observe too closely. The change, those same staff members would later recall, had not happened suddenly. It had arrived the way most significant things arrive gradually, almost imperceptibly, across a period of months that only looked like a pattern in hindsight. One longtime member of the villa's domestic staff, who had worked there for well over a decade before quietly requesting reassignment, described the shift in careful, measured language. The deliveries changed first. Boxes arrived that were carried inside by Camilla personally, without assistance, and stored in the private study that no member of staff had ever been asked to clean. Then came the instructions about the corridor. Certain walls were to be left untouched during routine maintenance. Not damaged, not marked, simply left exactly as they were, without question, without comment, and without any record made in the household log. When a younger member of staff made the mistake of entering the study to replace a burned-out lamp, she was met at the door within minutes. Nothing was said directly, but the following morning, her access to that wing of the villa was quietly and permanently revoked. It was around this same period that Camilla began extending her annual stays. What had originally been a week became 10 days, then a fortnight. She cited exhaustion, the demands of public life, the weight of ceremony, the need for genuine rest away from the machinery of the palace. The explanation was accepted without difficulty. No one at that level of royal life was expected to justify the need for privacy. But the requests that accompanied those extended stays grew more specific with each passing year. Additional filing materials were brought in archival quality folders, storage boxes, a particular type of adhesive that left no residue on painted surfaces. A second corkboard was installed in the study at her personal request, large enough to cover most of one wall. When the carpenter who fitted it mentioned its unusual dimensions to a colleague, he was reminded the following day of his confidentiality agreement. In the library, a shelf was gradually cleared of its original contents and restocked with a collection that staff were instructed never to catalog. The books that replaced the originals were not novels or histories in the conventional sense. They were collections of press archives, bound volumes of newspaper editions from specific years, and several privately commissioned photograph albums whose covers bore no titles. One aide, reflecting on those years much later, chose her words with evident care. It felt, she said, like the villa had developed a purpose that existed entirely separately from rest. But what happened after Camilla wrote, the letter found in that study changed the nature of everything that followed, and no one in the palace had been watching closely enough to notice. It was William who found it. The study was the smallest room in the villa, and in every other respect the least remarkable. A writing desk, a chair, 2 walls of shelving filled with the archival volumes staff had been instructed never to catalog. The corkboard the carpenter had fitted years earlier now occupied the entire surface of the far wall, its contents hidden beneath a heavy linen cloth that had been pinned at each corner with the same careful precision that defined every other detail in the house. Neither Charles nor William lifted the cloth immediately. They stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way men read a space when they already suspect what it contains. Then William crossed to the desk, and Charles moved to the shelving, and they worked in silence the way people work when speech would make something too real too quickly. The envelope was in the second drawer. It was not hidden, not concealed beneath other papers, or tucked inside a folder, or sealed behind anything that suggested deliberate burial. It sat in the center of the drawer with the self-possession of an object that had never expected to be found, simply because its owner had never imagined the drawer being opened by anyone other than herself. It was addressed to no one. The flap had been sealed and then, at some later point, carefully reopened. Whether Camilla had read it again recently or years ago, there was no way to tell. Charles took it from William's outstretched hand without a word. He stood beside the desk and read it slowly, his face moving through several expressions in sequence: confusion first, then a terrible dawning recognition, and finally something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but occupied the precise space between them. Then he passed it back and said, simply, that William should read it himself. The letter was not what either man had prepared himself for. It was not a declaration of hatred. It was not a threat or a manifesto or a record of grievances assembled over years into something coherent and cold. It was, instead, a confession, private, unsteady, and in places almost unbearably human. Camilla had written to Charles, in language stripped of all its public composure, about fear, not fury. Fear. The fear that Diana's hold on the public imagination was permanent and insurmountable. The fear that, no matter what she did or became or contributed, she would always be measured against a woman the world had already decided to love completely. The fear that she was perpetually losing a competition she had never chosen to enter against someone who was no longer even alive to know she had won. She had not written the letter to wound anyone. She had written it because she had nowhere else to put what she was carrying. She had never sent it. But tucked inside the envelope, beneath the final page, was a single press clipping, a photograph. The crash site in Paris. She had saved it alongside her own words, and that detail, more than anything else in the room, was the one neither Charles nor William could find a way to explain. The letter changed nothing about what was on the walls, but it changed everything about who had put it there and why no one had ever thought to ask. The call went out before they had left the villa's driveway. Charles made it himself, from the back seat of the car, in the low and deliberate tone he reserved for matters that could not be delegated. He did not explain over the phone what had been found. He said only that a meeting was required, that it was to be convened within the hour, and that the people in that room were to tell no one outside it why they had been summoned. The instruction was understood immediately and without question. In 40 years of royal service, those who received calls of that particular tone had learned that the details could wait. The urgency could not. By the time Charles and William returned to the palace, the council room was already filling. Senior advisors arrived in pairs, their faces arranged into the careful neutrality that long experience in royal service produces, an expression that communicates readiness without revealing anticipation. Private secretaries carried leather folders they had not yet been told how to fill. The head of palace security took his seat at the far end of the table and placed both hands flat on its surface, a habit those who knew him recognized as the physical equivalent of bracing. Charles entered last. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the head of the table and looked across the assembled faces with the expression of a man who has spent the journey home, deciding exactly how much truth a room can usefully receive at once. He told them enough. The silence that followed was of a particular quality, not the silence of shock, though shock was present, but the silence of a group of experienced people rapidly recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation they had believed was stable. Lady Margaret, one of the longest-serving members of the Royal Council, set her pen down on the table very carefully, as though a sudden movement might accelerate something that was already moving faster than any of them could comfortably manage. Sir Henry spoke first. His question was not about Camilla. It was about containment, specifically. How many people had access to the villa, how many staff members had worked there across the years, and whether any of them had spoken about what they had seen. The question was practical and precise and entirely correct, and Charles answered it with the measured honesty of a man who had already asked it of himself in the car on the way back, and had not arrived at a satisfying answer. William sat to his father's right and said very little. He had spoken at length during the drive back, had said what he needed to say, and had arrived at the meeting already several steps beyond the point where the advisors were now beginning. Those who observed him closely noted that his attention moved around the table with a quiet intentionality that was different from his father's approach, less focused on managing the information, more focused on the people receiving it. A decision was reached, though it was framed as a preliminary one. Camilla would need to be confronted before anything else could be addressed. Every other question, institutional, constitutional, public, was secondary to that. The machinery had already begun moving, and by the time Camilla's car turned back toward the villa, certain decisions had already been made without her. The first sign was the calendar. Camilla's upcoming engagements, a garden reception, 2 charity visits, a formal luncheon that had been in preparation for the better part of 6 weeks, disappeared from the official schedule, without announcement, without explanation, and without the customary notification sent to the offices of those who had been expecting her. No statement accompanied the removals. No aide was asked to offer a reason to the parties affected. The engagements were simply gone, as cleanly and completely as if they had never been entered, and the people who noticed said nothing, because the people above them had said nothing first. This was how it began, not with confrontation, not with declaration, with absence. William had initiated several of the steps himself, and he had done so with a precision that surprised even those closest to him. He had not waited for the council to reconvene. He had not waited for Charles to issue direction. Somewhere between the villa's driveway and the palace gates, he had made a series of decisions that he then executed, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment without knowing it. The moment when waiting for the correct procedure would cost more, then moving ahead of it. Camilla's office received no new briefings for the week ahead. The communications that would ordinarily have been routed to her private secretary were held at the point of dispatch without explanation. A member of her household staff, a woman who had served in the role for nearly 9 years, was reassigned to a different wing of the palace on the grounds of an internal restructuring that no one in her department had been informed was under consideration. Each individual change was, on its own, explainable. Administrative adjustments happened in large institutions. Schedules shifted. Staff moved between departments. Briefing documents were delayed. None of it, examined in isolation, would have alarmed anyone who was not already paying close attention. But those who were paying close attention noticed something else. A framed photograph that had occupied the same position in a palace corridor for the better part of several years had been moved, not removed, moved. It now faced a wall rather than the corridor, its image turned inward, visible only to anyone who made a deliberate point of looking. No instruction about the photograph appeared in any internal log. No member of staff admitted to having moved it. It had simply changed position overnight, the way objects do in houses where the people who live in them are working through something they have not yet found the words to say directly. Palace staff observed all of it and said nothing. This too was a kind of language, the fluent, practiced silence of people who understood that in houses governed by protocol, what is not said carries as much weight as what is. By the end of the second day, the shape of what was happening had become legible to anyone inside the palace who knew how to read it. William was not making noise, he was making facts. And facts, in institutions built on precedent and procedure, have a permanence that announcements rarely achieve. But one final meeting still remained, and it would happen not in a council room or a palace corridor, but face to face, in the villa, with Camilla standing in the doorway. Camilla heard the car before she saw it. She was in the garden when the sound reached her, the particular weight of a vehicle moving slowly along the gravel driveway with the deliberate pace of an arrival that has been planned rather than spontaneous. She did not turn immediately. She finished the sentence she had been reading, closed the book in her lap with the unhurried composure that had become, across decades of public life, as natural to her as breathing, and then she rose and walked toward the house. She saw their faces through the glass before she reached the door. Whatever she had expected from the remainder of her afternoon, it had not been this. But the expression she brought through the doorway was the one she always brought into difficult rooms, open, measured, faintly warm, constructed with the practiced skill of a woman who had learned very early that composure, maintained long enough, can substitute convincingly for innocence. Charles and William were standing in the main sitting room. Neither of them had sat down. Neither of them spoke immediately when she entered. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it had a texture to it, dense and load-bearing, that told Camilla, before a single word was exchanged, that whatever had brought them here was not administrative. William spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He had decided, sometime in the hours since the villa, that anger was a form of distance, that it would give Camilla something to respond to rather than something to answer for. So, he spoke with a quietness that was more demanding than fury, describing what they had found with the careful specificity of someone who needed the other person to understand that nothing had been missed, nothing misread, and nothing left to interpretation. Camilla listened without interrupting. Her expression shifted through several configurations: surprise, concern, a brief flash of something that might have been calculation before settling into the one she had clearly decided would serve her best. Measured, sorrowful, misunderstood. She said that she could explain. That context was everything. That what they had seen was research, was documentation, was the private work of a woman trying to understand a history she had been entangled in without choosing to be. Her voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to having their intentions trusted above their actions, and she deployed it now with the fluency of long practice. Charles said nothing. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the envelope. He did not open it. He did not need to. He simply held it in his hand, at his side, and looked at her. Camilla went very still. The composure did not leave her face immediately. It withdrew slowly, the way light withdraws from a room at dusk, gradual enough that you almost miss the moment it is gone. Then she said, in a voice stripped of everything she had walked in wearing, that she had never thought anyone would find it. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say she had been wrong. She said only that she had never thought anyone would find it, and in that sentence, the distinction between explanation and confession collapsed entirely. William left the room before his father did. The institutional decision had already been made. But what Charles chose to carry privately after the door closed and the room fell silent was something no advisor would ever be asked to weigh. The first headline appeared before dawn. No one inside the palace knew precisely how it had happened, which conversation had been overheard, which document had moved through the wrong hands, which member of staff had said one sentence too many to one person too willing to listen. These things rarely announced their origins. They simply arrived, the way damage arrives in old buildings, suddenly visible, though the weakness had been present for far longer than anyone had noticed. Charles was shown the front page before he had finished his morning briefing. He read it once, set it down, and asked the room to give him a moment alone. The headline was not inaccurate. That, in certain ways, made it worse. By mid-morning, the story had moved from the newspapers to the television networks, and from the television networks to every screen that carried a signal. Anchors spoke in the grave, measured tones that broadcasters reserve for stories too serious for ordinary register, describing the villa, the photographs, the annotations, the edited headlines, each detail offered to the public with the careful precision of people who understood that the images themselves, even described rather than shown, were sufficiently disturbing to require no embellishment. Social media did not exercise the same restraint. Within hours, the story had fragmented into 1,000 simultaneous conversations, each one louder than the last. Hashtags accumulated at a speed that the palace communications team tracked in real time from a room that had grown very quiet. Ordinary people who had never previously expressed a strong opinion about the royal family were now expressing several, with a conviction that suggested personal injury. The photographs of Diana, even the blurred and partially obscured versions that the networks had chosen to broadcast, carried an emotional weight that translated across every platform, every language, every time zone that the story reached before noon. Royal commentators were called upon by every outlet that could reach them. They spoke from studios and living rooms and hotel lobbies, their faces serious, their language carefully chosen, but their conclusions largely uniform. What had been found in the villa was not the behavior of a public figure in good standing. The monarchy's capacity to manage the fallout would depend entirely on how quickly and how honestly it chose to respond. Every hour of silence, one analyst observed, would be interpreted as complicity. Inside the palace, the communications team presented Charles with 3 possible statements. He read all 3 and approved none of them. Too much, he said of the first. Too little, he said of the second. The third, he said, sounded like a document written by people who were afraid, and fear, in a statement, is always visible to the people reading it. William watched the coverage from a room on the upper floor. He did not pace. He stood at the window and observed the news cycle with the focused stillness of someone who had already moved past the point the coverage was currently describing. The public was now arriving at a version of the story he had lived 3 days earlier, in a corridor, with his father, in silence. The palace had not yet spoken, and every minute it did not. The world filled the silence with its own conclusions. The public did not have all the facts, but they had enough to have already decided, and inside the palace, everyone understood that no statement would change that now. The service had been on the calendar for several months. It was the kind of occasion the palace scheduled with the long-range precision of an institution that understands the symbolic weight of appearances, a formal church service, attended by senior members of the royal family, covered by the approved press pool, photographed from the designated positions, and reported on in the measured language that ceremonial events typically produce. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have generated a single column in the broadsheets and a brief segment on the evening news before being absorbed into the vast, untroubled archive of royal routine. These were not ordinary circumstances. The crowd that gathered outside the church that morning was larger than the occasion would normally have drawn. People arrived early and stood in patient, quiet lines along the approach, their faces carrying the particular expression of those who have come not to celebrate but to witness, to be present at a moment they sense will be remembered, even if they cannot yet say precisely why. Charles arrived in the first car. He stepped out into the gray morning light, with the composure of a man who had been preparing for this specific walk for several days. Not the physical walk, which was brief and familiar, but the internal one. The kind that requires a person to decide, in advance and with complete commitment, what their face will say when words are neither appropriate nor available. He walked toward the church entrance at the measured pace that decades of public ceremony had made instinctive. His posture was correct. His expression was composed, and beside him, where the approved walking order had for some time placed Camilla, there was no one. The space was not dramatic in its emptiness. It was simply there, a precise and undeniable gap in the visual grammar of a family that the public had learned to read like a language, attending carefully to proximity and position and the angle of a shoulder as evidence of what could not be officially stated. Those who had followed royal appearances for years understood immediately what the empty space communicated. Those who had not still felt it, in the way that absences make themselves felt even to people who cannot name what is missing. William walked a half step behind his father and to the right. His posture was upright and forward-facing, his gaze directed ahead with the kind of settled resolve that belongs to someone who has made peace with a decision and no longer needs to revisit it. He did not look at the space beside his father. He did not need to. He had known for days that it would be empty. A photographer positioned at the approved distance captured a single frame as Charles reached the church steps. In it, the king's right hand had moved slightly from his side, not reaching, not gesturing, simply shifting in the way that hands sometimes shift when the body moves ahead of the mind. Then it returned to his side. The frame lasted less than a second. By evening, it had been seen by more people than any statement the palace had issued all week. No one spoke. No one needed to. The space beside the king told a story that no palace statement had managed to tell, and the world was watching every inch of it. The villa was cleaned in the first week. A small team was sent without announcement, arriving early on a Tuesday morning when the surrounding roads were still quiet. They worked through the day, with the efficient silence of people who had been given precise instructions and no context, removing what needed to be removed, repainting where the walls required it, returning each room to the condition it had presented on the morning. Charles and William first walked through the gates. By evening, the corridor held nothing but light. The study was empty. The corkboard was gone. The shelves had been cleared and left bare, waiting for whatever would eventually replace what had been taken away. The villa looked, once again, exactly like a place of rest. But the days that followed did not rest. They accumulated slowly, each one adding its particular weight to a situation that the palace was managing with the careful, exhausting precision of an institution that had survived worse and understood, from long experience, that survival required the appearance of continuity, even when continuity was precisely what had been broken. Camilla's privileges were reviewed in a series of quiet internal meetings that produced no public statement and left no accessible record. Several were not renewed. The process was described, in the language the palace used for such things, as an administrative recalibration, a phrase designed to be accurate without being informative. Those who understood what it meant said nothing. Those who did not were not told. William's role in the weeks that followed was visible to those inside the institution and invisible to everyone outside it. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. He did not seek acknowledgement for the steps he had taken. He returned to his schedule with the focused discipline of someone who has completed a thing that needed completing and does not require it to be named. Charles was quieter than usual in those weeks. Those who worked closely with him noted it without comment, a slight increase in the pauses before he spoke, a tendency to remain at his desk for longer than necessary after meetings had concluded. He had read the letter again, alone, on the night after the confrontation at the villa. He had not destroyed it. He had not shown it to anyone. It remained where he had placed it, in a drawer in his private study, alongside other things he had chosen to carry without explanation. In a routine rotation of the palace's portrait collection, the kind of administrative process that occurs several times each year without particular significance, a photograph of Diana appeared in a corridor where it had not hung for some time. No instruction had been issued regarding its placement. No member of staff could account for the specific decision to position it where it now stood. It was simply there one morning, in a frame that caught the light from the window opposite, and no one moved it. Camilla was seen once, in the garden of a private residence, by a single member of her remaining staff. She was reading, her face, the aide later said, choosing the words with evident care, was calm. The kind of calm, they added, that costs something. In the end, the villa's walls were cleaned, the photographs removed, and the rooms returned to the quiet luxury they had always shown the world. But what had been written there in ink, in obsession, in 20 years of unspoken fear, could not be stripped away as easily as a title. Some things, once seen, change the shape of everything that surrounds them. And inside the palace, in the spaces where certain conversations are never held, that truth continued to do what it had always done: wait in silence for someone with the courage to finally speak it aloud.